Okay, well, it is 12:01 and I will open the event today. Um, my name is Martha Rance. I'm the legal director of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society, and we are really pleased to be here today to provide you with an offering of interest, education, advice perhaps. And we are located on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We thank them for their forbearance of our presence on their land. And today we are going to be talking about a subject that is quite personal to me, it turns out, in that I was single parenting my daughter when was it now? 2005, and working for the provincial government, and found myself being told when I went back to work after mat leave, that I had to stay at the office until 4:30 in New Westminster every day without fail, or I would face discipline. Needless to say, this caused something of an issue for me because the only way I could get on public transit from New Westminster to my home and pick up my daughter from the shared childcare situation, which was the only childcare available for me at the time, was by leaving the office to make sure that I got onto the SkyTrain for 4:30. I was not accommodated and found myself 2.5 months later, after 26 pages of back and forth between myself and the employer, being terminated and filing a complaint on the basis of family status. Didn't go very far. We ended up resolving it, but I lost a lot out of the process, not least of which was 6 years of employment and the employment history that goes with that, which might have included pension credits when I lost that job. And so when I saw late last year, I think it was November, the Fraser decision come out from the Supreme Court of Canada, in which the Supreme Court of Canada basically, as Clea is going to point out, reaffirmed that women's reproductive choices, so to speak, are ones that must be accommodated by employers, and that the court found in favor of the three plaintiffs, each of whom had job shared from their original positions in order to manage their childcare needs and remain members of the RCMP. And because they were part-time and chose to be part-time, they were not able to buy back their pension benefits as their, mostly male colleagues who had been disciplined by the RCMP were able to do at the time. So it's an important decision. And it prompted me to think about the needs that we continue to have, whether we parent or not, to have acknowledged our role as mothers, our role as parents in the workplace, and how, in fact, we still have a long way to go, baby, in a nod to a cigarette commercial from my time, perhaps not everyone else's. In any event, I reached out to Amanda Watson, a friend and professor at Simon Fraser University in the Department of Sociology, a feminist of a different generation from my own, one I respect immensely, who wrote a book and called it Juggling Mothers, Coming Undone in the Age of Anxiety, which for me spoke volumes to what I remember experiencing and what I know Amanda is experiencing as a mother of two young children. And I thought of who best to enter into a conversation around adverse effect discrimination, family status, the meaning of the law for women than my other great friend, Clea Parfitt, a human rights lawyer in Vancouver, probably nationally known now for her role in acting on behalf of women in a variety of circumstances, including sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, and everything in between, and many, many other important cases on behalf of both women and other folks who've experienced discrimination in the province of BC. I welcome you both today. We're going to start with hearing a little bit from Amanda apropos of the book and her view of the case, and then we'll hear from Clea, and there will be lots of time for questions. So please, if you have a burning question, put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and jumping in at the appropriate point. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Martha, for that glowing introduction. I got a little teary-eyed there really unexpectedly. I think this is a really inspiring way to start to think about this cross-generation solidarity and how old this project, this feminist project is of visibilizing the work that disproportionately falls to women, whether or not they have children. This unpaid work that I tell my students has been like hammered into the backbone of global capitalist flow. Thank you very much to Angela and Paige too of Pleo for having me today. And I'm really honored to be here with you, Clea, and to chat a little bit about the case and the conditions of the case, the conditions that we're living in with respect to work that give rise to such a thing. And so I thought I would just begin briefly by telling you a little bit about the title of my book and where it came from and the sort of main arguments. And I won't take up too much time doing that because I would love to talk about what I'm thinking of today as the F word and the C word of today. I won't spoil that. I'll leave that until the end of end of my thesis here. So the book, The Juggling Mother, there it is, Coming Undone in the Age of Anxiety. I started studying representations of motherhood in popular culture and public health campaigns and advertisements and traditional media before I had children and before I really realized how my work, what kind of work that my body would do in exchange for a wage and to support my partner's wage. And I think that what motivated the book in my early 20s and like the research, my graduate research, was a sense of confusion about what feminist action looks like anymore. I was raised in the 90s and the early aughts. Like I just watched the Britney Spears documentary and I remember I just like was brought back to that time of like Spice Girl feminism. Like you can do it. You can be the prime minister. You can be an astronaut. You can be an engineer or whatever. The sort of equality feminism that rubbed up against this kind of tacit expectation that, of course, if you want to have children and you happen to be a woman, that you would take on an unfair share of the load. Because I was seeing as a young sociology student, those kinds of statistics that were just stubbornly entrenched, even as women flooded the workplace. And so those are really fraught conditions in my 20s. I was having this major identity crisis. Like, how am I going to do this? What am I going to do with my family formation plans? Will it even be conditions of choice? And so when I dug into the research, I realized that the ideal mother subject, as we see it represented around us, is no longer a housewife. She's no longer the like devoted maternal subject of kind of 1950s propaganda, nor is she this gender neutral robotic sort of entrepreneur or Silicon Valley CEO, but in fact she's both. So that's where I landed. I was like, okay, so how do we see, what kind of symbols do we see around us that are telling women to excel in all of these ways? And the juggling mother then is this trope. She's not a real person, but I think if we just close our eyes, she comes to mind, right? Like she's doing the most at work. she's floating stylishly into the meeting and she's kicking ass there, never really dropping the ball there, taking up just the right amount of space. She alludes to moments of feminine softness in sort of the background, just so that we trust her as a woman. And then she goes back home and she does the most at work, and her kids are set up to be financially successful and they're in the right scheduled activities. And this is impossible. That's why it's a trope. It's not a real person. But we trust the juggling mother is never going to drop the ball. So that's what the juggling metaphor refers to. And the coming undone language is meant to capture both what women say when asked about how they feel about their multiple competing demands, and how we see this represented in pop culture around us. So I was trying to get at this sort of sense of too muchness that women report feeling when they have competing obligations of their time, and role strain, it's often called in the sociological literature, or the second shift or the third shift, or the mental load, or emotional labor. And that involves like anxiety at times, depression, stress, like sometimes it's acute, sometimes it's latent. And in the COVID context, it's sort of like a blanket of all of this. It's dynamic depending on where you are in your day. And what I wanted to get at with the coming undone part of the argument is that we're encouraging this figure, like women today and mothers, to be always sort of careening against the edge of burnout, but never quite burning out. And so we trust this figure is doing the most and is doing right by her obligations to society when she's proving that she's at the edge, when she's exhausted. So when she's fully dedicated to both like capitalist forms of success and recognizable forms of exchanging your body for a wage, and unpaid care work and nurturant work. And that's, we trust her the most when she seems like she's almost depleted to the point of falling apart, but she never actually falls apart. She never actually comes undone. And so my critique, and why this is a little bit controversial, the controversial part of the argument is that this kind of performance of juggling is only available to very privileged people. It's overrepresenting whiteness and affluence, and even that person is unfairly burdened with the motherhood penalty at work and an unfair share of the load at home. And the age of anxiety was not referring to COVID, by the way, in the title. It was uncertain climate futures. Like then the book came out midway through the pandemic, and I think all that I would change about the argument is that the juggling mother was just handed an elephant, and it's just like, it's impossible. We now she's homeschooling and she's doing a full other job. And I'd also emphasize the age of anxiety is now COVID times, when we are seeing these reports of mental health that disproportionately impact mothers. And they're intensified by, I think, trying to protect our families from experiencing the pandemic anxiety that we are. And I can only speak, anecdotally about what that's like for little kids. And I think it's a lot easier having toddlers at this moment than it would be having school-aged kids or teenagers, in some respects, in terms of the anxiety part, because my kids' social needs are not as demanding, and they don't really understand the news. And so I would add to the book and the title, if we're putting it into the COVID context, that there's a new pressure on women who are tasked with making it feel all better in insecure times, whether or not they're mothers. And now we have a crisis. And so the magic of Christmas and the magic of birthdays is labor that has to come from somewhere, and that women disproportionately do. So that's the thesis of the book. But what I was thinking about in terms of today, in terms of this, the C word and the F word, I think what the Fraser case made me think about is how snugly the notion of choice, the choices that women make, and choice rhetoric is still part of our culture and part of the way we understand women's work. And in my class, I call that the myth of choice, or neoliberal choice rhetoric, or, like, this isn't, when women left the workforce, we still saw it framed as a choice, like in COVID. And that's infuriating to me. Like, what are the conditions in which women must navigate their labors and keep their families alive? And can we not problematize this word? And the case is obviously responding to forces that would like this word, that would like women's behavior to hinge on this word so that they can't be protected. And that's just, it fills me with rage, actually. And the F word being flexibility, because I think we're at a time when the silver lining of workplace transformation might be more flexible workplace policies, and families have been asking for this, and feminist research has been pointing to giving workers more flexibility and autonomy as a kind of way to shift potentially loads of unpaid work and stigma. But we know, in fact, but from research on the motherhood penalty, that if workplace policies that increase flexibility, and Martha, I'm thinking about your story right now, if we know that when women take them, they're still stigmatized, and that often like leaders aren't making use of these policies, that flexibility actually is not a progressive word. It's about keeping markets flexible and keeping companies flexible, and making women make themselves flexible rather than having the conditions of their work be flexible. And I think that's a terrain that's shifting as we speak in COVID times. And so that's something that I also thought would be interesting to chat with you about, Clea, a little bit as it pertains to law and also policy. And so I think now would be a good time just to ask you a little bit about the Fraser case, Clea, and sort of your reactions, which certainly educated me.
Well, Fraser, as you point out, Martha, is a case about a provision that permitted people in the workplace, it wasn't directed at women, permitted people to job share. But what happened, unsurprisingly, is that the people who chose to job share were almost universally moms. And this was within the RCMP. And as Martha was mentioning, the way the policy ended up working was that if you chose to job share, then you took a pension hit. You were not permitted to buy back that extra time when you returned, I guess, to full-time work. Whereas other people who were out of the workplace for reasons that, sometimes were quite serious, like discipline, were able to buy back their time. And so these three women attempted first to deal with the issues internally, unsuccessfully, and then brought what is in fact a charter challenge to the rule that they couldn't buy back their time. They, I think, were successful. They were not successful, I don't think, at either level of court. And I think both earlier levels of court took the position that they chose to make this choice, and so they weren't entitled to buy back their time. And I think there was some technical argument about, well, they're working part-time, so it's not the same as being out of the workplace altogether, which is kind of ironic. But the Supreme Court of Canada, in a 6-3 decision, very clearly written by Madam Justice Abella, very clearly took the position, no, this is adverse impact discrimination. But when I read the case, the thing that was so profoundly evident to me in Madam Justice Abella's decision is that what she's saying practically in each paragraph is, this is already the law. It's already the law that we look at adverse impact, and it's already the law that adverse impact has to be taken account of, and that if adverse impact is present, then what you're doing may be discriminatory and we may need to address it. And she's very clear, and she makes reference to a number of cases from the late 80s, including Jansen, which is the case having to do with sexual harassment, and Brooks, which is a case having to do with whether or not pregnancy discrimination is discrimination on the basis of gender, and says very clearly, we have known this for a long time. We've known that you need to look at adverse impact. And if you do look at adverse impact, then you'll be able to see that a policy that may be neutral on its face, or a rule that may be neutral on its face, is going to can have a very adverse impact on a particular group of people because of their historic sort of disadvantage based on their personal characteristics. So the case for me was refreshing because she, one of the great things about Abella is she's very clear, to the point almost of being reductionist. And, it's clear that her message is still required. We have a tribunal here which struggles with adverse impact discrimination, even, very recently made a decision in a case called Harvey versus Gibraltar Mines, which in some ways is a similar case where a family had two workers, both working at the mine, in a system that involved 12-hour shifts. And so, of course, once they had children, they had a great deal of difficulty retrieving their children from daycare if they were both working the same shift. And if they weren't working the same shift, then they never saw one another. So the two parents, So our tribunal managed to understand that that could be family status discrimination, but was unable to understand that that could be sex discrimination or marital status discrimination, because the tribunal member said, well, this rule was not created because she was a woman or because she was married, to which the answer obviously is no, but the impact on her arises because she's married and because she's a woman and is caregiving. So, even our tribunal, which is supposed to be an expert tribunal, is still struggling with this concept of adverse effect discrimination. And for me, the case Fraser sort of sits within this larger pool of law that we have whose entire project, it seems to me, is to try and moderate the excesses of capitalism. So we have the Employment Standards Act, we have the health and safety provisions of the Workers' Compensation Act, we have labor codes, we have human rights codes, and then we have the charter. All of that legislation exists to try and create some sort of balance between work and the demands of work, and then the demands that women and people are facing in their home, to a project which I have to say I think is failing, because I feel like, as Amanda points out in her book, the conditions of labor are becoming more precarious, not less precarious. We have the gig economy, we have people working less and less for a single employer, we have a decline in unionization, and we have, now we have the increase in people working from home, which, I think brings us to a very interesting question, which is, yes, we've seen this tremendous increase in how flexibility how work can be done flexibly, or how flexibility can be a part of the work life. But by sending work home, have we erased the final barrier that was protecting women from total porousness between their work life and their other domestic and personal obligations? And so maybe I would throw that question to you, Amanda. Do you think that all of this work from home is liberating women, is going to have is there going to be a flexibility bonus, or has it just meant that the capitalists have finally recruited every last minute of our day as potential work time, which I think is constantly the pressure, and indeed was the pressure in the RSMP case in Fraser, and was really the pressure in Gibraltar Mines. I mean, Gibraltar Mines works 24/7, and there's no comment in the decision whatsoever that maybe it's unreasonable for an employer to want to own 24/7 of your time.
Oh man, okay, well, a lot comes to mind. Three things. I'll stick to three things. The first thing that I thought about in thinking about both, if we assume for a second a dyadic family with two working parents, which is a lot of families now, I think that some of the mental load has been visibilized, having both parents at home. And I think that some of what we think of as little micro nuclear family decisions that are actually systemic forces, some of those impacts on our divisions of work have fallen apart a little bit. And so just to give you an example, I'm in a relationship where we strive to have a feminist division of labor and feminist kinds of conversations. And yet a year ago, our division of labor was not equal and not even close. And some of the things that I would take on is the daycare happens to be at my workplace, so I'm going to do pick up and drop off, and et cetera, and those kinds of justifications. It happens that women tend to get off earlier, and that it is more likely that they're closer to the daycare, and these things are not actually just unique to our family situation. But when the pandemic hit and we started sharing those things, we also started sharing me hollering out oh, so-and-so is growing out of their bathing suit, and so I've been thinking about getting them the next size up, and things that I would totally take on without a conversation typically. And so that, for me, as someone who has studied feminist activists who have since Sylvia Federici tried to visibilize the unpaid work that women do, I think we're seeing in headlines as well that people are more aware of what it takes to run a household now that more people are in the household, now that there are more adults in the household. And that feels powerful to me. That feels like a shift. But I am not, feeling super glowy about the idea of that powerlessness, but also where is the room of our own? You know, I feel like I'm worried about women not having space outside of the home to carve out their own inner life and time away from their unpaid labor expectations. And so that feels really daunting. And I think this image in the New York Times captured it well. We have a 2-parent household, and the both parents are working at home, and the father was on in the office and behind a desk checking his email, and the woman who was on a call in a meeting was like doing the toilet training with the toddler. And I just thought, like, yeah, that rings true. And that stuff is also not just one off. That is also, right, like statistically, that's how these things shake out. And that's how it shakes out at my house when we're both home. And our excuse is, oh, my daughter only goes to me and whatever. But like, we have shaped those bonds. We have like created those conditions in our household. And so that's what I find scary. And definitely access to the employer, or the employer's access to the employee is daunting. But I kind of feel like that with smartphone technology was already upon us. Like I'm curious to see how people would use time diaries and actually like say what hours they're working at. And definitely in the pandemic with the kids at home, I've pulled a lot of late nights and ridiculous overnight type work situations. But I think of those as the exception, at least in my kind of privileged role, and not something that I'm going to keep doing. But definitely just having internet at home. I think so. I don't know if we'll find that employers expect more access just because we're not on site if we are already like had email and phone expectations anyway. Be curious to see how that shakes out. But actually, maybe I'd turn that back to you, Clea, and think like, what are you imagining? Because I think you have your work is in different industries, right, in terms of labor. So which kinds of industries are suddenly able to pivot to working from home that you might expect would shift, and would like the pivot of which you might expect would shift the conditions of the work? I'd be interested to hear.
Well, I think that anyone who has to do a thing that requires them to be face to face with other people obviously isn't working at home. And so if you're a surgeon, or if you're, a barista at Starbucks, you're not working from home. So it's an interesting cross-cutting effect, that there are people at every level of the economic range who are not able to work from home, and vice versa. There are people at every level of the economic range. Telemarketers can work from home, CEOs can work from home. And so, it changes up that it's not going to cut in a clean socioeconomic way, although I think more people at the lower ends of the pay scale at least will be working not from home, because you think about all the cleaning work, you think about all the personal service work, much of which is poorly paid, including, the service work that we see in restaurants and other kinds of services like that. All of that work is going to have to go on not from home. So I think there's that interesting effect. What I think is interesting about work from home is that we have created boundaries around work by looking at the time that you're required to be at work. So we have the Employment Standards Act that creates these firm boundaries that says, a workday is 8 hours. If you're working more than 8 hours, then you're entitled to more pay. If you're called out, you're entitled to be paid for a minimum number of hours. I mean, these are ideas that have less and less relevance when people are working from home and probably not working a straight 8 hours or 2 4-hour blocks with a half-hour lunch. Like, that's not really
right.
a thing at home. And so then does that mean that there's a change to evaluating work on a task basis versus a time basis? Like, we've tended to measure it by time, but maybe what we're really moving into is more measuring by task, which I think is consistent with what a gig economy is as well, where you take on a certain pool of work, which is task defined, and however long it takes you to do it, the employer doesn't care. And so then that puts a lot of pressure on individual employees to be constantly pushing back and saying, well, that task you gave me, that's a whole day task. That's not a 5-minute task. And, so being reasonably compensated by task, which is going to be a lot harder conversation. I mean, it's easier to measure an hour. Everyone agrees what an hour is, but it's harder to say what's a fair value for that task when we don't necessarily agree how much time it takes or how much effort it takes. So I think it's I can see an increase in difficult conversations about how work should be valued. And, there's always pressure from the employer to get more for less. And, we invented unions as human beings because of that difficulty of individuals bargaining with an all-powerful employer. And maybe now where people have multiple employers, that improves their bargaining situation. You're in a better bargaining situation if you drive for Lyft and Uber than if you just drive for Uber. Maybe, but question mark. So, and one of the things that I wondered about was one of the few initiatives that we're seeing at the moment in terms of easing the burden on the care burden on moms in particular is universal daycare. And we have actually been seeing a consistent push for universal daycare. But I wondered with the effects of COVID, whether people will be less interested in those kinds of institutional solutions and more interested in having a pool of money saved for themselves that they can then apply to childcare as they will. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, a little bit. I think it has pointed to a need for emergency childcare like COVID has, and there have been a lot of people who have needed irregular hours of childcare who have found major shortages. And there's research on the Vancouver case in particular, because there's just not a lot of options there's a shortage. We're in a childcare crisis here. And that I think it would be helpful to think about care work as happening on a 24/7 kind of clock. But I think putting more money in people's pockets to put Band-Aid solutions on care does not systemically overhaul the way we think about like early childhood education. And I've been part of a few conversations recently in BC that I think reveal like we're back to a place, politically speaking, where there is a critical mass of people wanting to center early childhood education at the heart of our political discussions in terms of closing gaps in social stratification. And there's lots of good research about how beneficial it is to families. So not only is it like the single bullet, the silver bullet kind of solution for assisting women in poverty and single moms and closing a socioeconomic gap between women, but also outcomes for kids and families. And so I always kind of point to that when people ask for like the recommendation. I hope that we're at a place where we're seeing political will. And I think that this government indicates that they understand just how powerful early childhood education and universal, affordable, accessible, diverse, tailored to communities, childcare could be.
And do you see a tension between affordability and the quality of the care? I've been seeing a lot of conversation about sort of the $10 a day daycare, but it seems to me that if what you were talking about is providing a high quality early childhood education, those two might be different things, though we might not be fully recognizing that.
I think that's a bit of a myth, actually, because my kids are in a big center and they are trying to pilot the $10 a day thing, and they have requirements that the educators there are ECEs, and it doesn't mean that all kids will thrive in that space, but I think a comprehensive plan, from the government would include quality as like part of what is accessible and affordable. So it can't just be $10 a day daycare. But I think there's a big myth that like once you make something universal and affordable, suddenly we're all dropping our 2-year-olds off or our 1-year-olds off at like a gymnasium with 50 other 1-year-olds. Like that, I think that's like what the fear that people have is that we're gonna like raise kids in these bins and and hope that one size fits all model works out for people. So I guess like if I were consulting this government, I would say part of your marketing should involve ensuring that, like, telling people that you have researchers who are looking into the different families' needs in terms of childcare and how to meet the needs of kids with disabilities and parents with disabilities, especially when sometimes those disabilities, if they're neurodivergence, are start to appear before school age. And it's a complicated situation, but I like will die on this hill.
and if I can just jump in on that point, I think that, you know, I was really concerned, Clea, when the beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot of, and the return to school was a big issue in September of last year, and a lot of families tending to be sort of upper middle class, affluent, educated folks I might have known in Toronto and in, or maybe in Kitsilano, I don't know, who wanted to create pods so they could teach the kids themselves. And I have noticed a tendency in some of my incredibly well-educated and bright friends to a discovery that they think they are better teachers than teachers are, and that actually this is a way for them to get their kids out of the system and start demanding funding from government to support these pods, because they should be supported in a way that childcare systems are supported. And I thought it was like there were two different conversations happening, and not a lot of and at that time not a lot of recognition of the many kids who really do need that social connection that comes from being in school, and to being in group settings, and how important that is, and how many kids were really struggling with the online, and are still. I mean, the middle school kids who go to school for an hour and come home and have very little to do other than play video games, you know? So it's a, you know, it's an ongoing concern, and one that I hope, if anything, we come out of this with some better policy. I really, you know, I hope that this is an opportunity for government to put money in areas that historically it hasn't had the quote unquote money for, where right now we're just awash in money, partly because of low interest rates and so on. We're going to run a little poll while we're talking now, from curious about what your experiences are, those of you in the audience, whether you've been affected by the motherhood penalty in your workplace, and whether you're optimistic, because I think that's sort of part of the underlying question here. And I'd like to invite anyone to ask a question. I know we have a comment from Susan Harney in the chat from the Coalition of Childcare Advocates, part of the $10 a day childcare advocacy. We are working very closely with the Minister of Childcare, where quality is the most important thing for child. Parents who've been able to access $10 a day say it's life-changing. The ministry may not get it all right for sure, but we're making real progress. Also advocating for control of services by Indigenous folks to run their own programs, very well funded. Also, there's research happening regarding flexible and non-standard care. That's great. I'm glad to hear that that's happening. I think we all share thanks to all of the childcare advocates who've been demanding changes in these areas, ECEBC, First Call, and the Coalition of Childcare Advocates. And what was it? Sharon Gregson was very active when I was, I think she was on council briefly too, or maybe she ran. Anyway, so any questions from the assembly? Well, nothing so far. So one question I have, which is sort of unrelated to this, or related, but it's very sort of, how many, do you know, Clea, whether there's an increase in like complaints to the Human Rights Tribunal in light of COVID related issues?
I haven't seen statistics suggesting that there's been an increase, and interestingly, I haven't had too many COVID questions. I probably had one or two. So I wouldn't say, I mean, the tribunal doesn't turn on a dime. And so if you have a problem arising in COVID, maybe it'll get resolved. I mean, I did have one client who came to me working for a delivery service, and which was terribly overwhelmed in the Christmas time partly because they were already slammed from COVID. And he was disabled, and they were saying to him, you have to work, we want you to work late. And he was like, I can't work late because of my disability. And there was a real lack of flexibility on the part of the employer around that, but I think it got sorted out. So I imagine there's been a lot of difficult conversations in workplaces about, I can't do that anymore because I now have to do this. And or that the workplace demands are increasing and employees are pushing back and saying, yeah, you may need more from me, but I can't give more to you because actually the demands on me are greater already. So I wouldn't say that it's risen to the level of complaints, but that may, people have a year to file. And so those human rights complaints may come. Certainly, I was struck by something you said, even in your introduction, that Fraser stands for the proposition that employers must accommodate reproductive needs. I don't think Fraser goes nearly that far. I think what Fraser says is if you create a rule and it has a disparate impact, you might be responsible for responding to that. But I think to say that there's anything in Fraser that it proactively requires employers to look after reproductive needs, no, Fraser does not go anywhere near, doesn't come close to that. And indeed, we have this very interesting situation in the human rights frame in British Columbia, where our Court of Appeal has very firmly said, your care obligations do not create a human rights complaint unless there's some substantial interference with a significant requirement, or maybe it's the other way around, a significant interference with a substantial requirement. But anyway, the standard is very high to ever establish that your care issues that you have are the employer's responsibility to accommodate, let alone to deal with. So, that we've set that bar super high, and that's really was really the fight in that Gibraltar Mines case, where the employer is saying their response was, there's nothing special about your care needs and we don't need to accommodate them and you have to work this out. So even though they were working out of town, even though they had these 12-hour shifts, even though they were demanding 100% access to people's time, basically, even though they were providing no on-site daycare, their view was, whatever problems this working arrangement causes, that's yours to figure out.
Yeah, it's a perpetuation of the realm. It's in the private realm. It's
in the private realm. And particularly interesting in that case because you have a woman who's working as a welder, so she's working in a non-traditional role for women, and still zero support from the employer. So it's, I'm pleased that she's filed a human rights complaint. I'm pleased the tribunal managed to find a way not to dismiss it. I'm sorry that it's now subject to judicial review, because I don't find that our courts are strong at all on human rights issues. And when it's difficult to explain adverse impact discrimination to a tribunal member, how hard it's going to be to explain that to a judge. And even though it's absolutely the bedrock of our human rights and charter law, the inability to grasp that concept and how it plays out is pretty stunning.
Yeah. Well, that's a downer.
That could be
I'll say.
So I think our care, where we are on care and where we are in adverse effect discrimination, the law on adverse effect discrimination is good, but the practice in the courts is not that great. The law on care is bad, and the practice is, follows the badness of it. So those are areas where I think we're struggling in the law, at least in a practical way.
And Jennifer points out that when you have children under 2, they get sick a lot if they are going to daycare, and employers can be unforgiving or unwilling to allow work from home, at least prior to COVID. So you can run the risk of losing your job just because you have to care for a sick child. And I think this is, this is also a big issue in COVID right now with getting sick leave. incorporated into employment standards statutes, not just on a temporary basis as they are here, but across the country as a standard, so that people don't go to work sick, and that there's some acknowledgement that when you have to take care of someone who is ill, that there be some flexibility there, some of what I would call accommodation.
And I do think, I am optimistic that the fact that almost every employer has had to have a large part of their workforce working from home is going to make it much harder for those same employers to now argue down the road, I can't be flexible, I can't have people working from home. This person who has a disability can't stay at home and do their work from there. Those arguments are going to be way less believable. And, when they say that to me in the hearing room, I'm going to be saying, produce your documentation of how many people work from home during COVID. So it's given us this tremendous argument about flexibility that we didn't have before. And it's been, a giant, cross the entire spectrum of the economy experiment on whether people can work from home, to which the answer turns out to be hell yes. And, I'm sure employers to some degree have been less scrutinizing of the work that's being done at home than they might have been in other circumstances. But I'm not hearing a lot of employers moaning about how the work's not getting done. I don't think that's, certainly in terms of the documentation that I've seen in the public press, I haven't seen that kind of concern being articulated. I don't know, Amanda, what are you hearing about that?
I haven't seen that either, and I am curious. I'm curious about how the stigma that mothers face could stick to them now that they're working from home, because we are seeing evidence that when women work from home, they do twice as much childcare as men do when they work from home. So we have to think that women must not be able then to be getting as much work done, and if that stigma makes this, if it gets stuck to women, then all optimism about this shift is sort of lost. And I thought maybe we could take up Elena's question in the chat, because I love to hear if Clea, if you have thoughts on this. So she says, what about family law? Have you heard much about an expected wave of post-pandemic separations and divorce? And I have a little bit of background on, how women who are divorced are more likely to be in poverty, and when men divorce, their incomes go up. There's no correlation between divorced men and poverty, and there's still a strong correlation between divorced women and poverty. And I've always been confused about this with respect to the law, because I've always thought of BC family law as being progressive and thinking about pension and trying to protect as much as possible about those protect women as much as possible from those adverse effects.
Yeah, I don't practice any family law, so I don't have that kind of direct experience, but I do sit on the board at Rise Women's Legal Center. And so we have been having conversation, which is a legal center that provides advice to women, mostly in respect of family law or people identifying as women. And certainly there's been an increase in reported family violence, and there have been tremendous tensions within families because of everybody being at home for an extended period of time. Some of the safety valves that being able to leave and go to work or send your children out to school or whatever have not existed. So I'm sure that there will be relationships that flounder on that amount of contact. It is bound to bring out the cracks in certain relationships, and I'm sure that there will be divorces that are caused, that one can attribute to COVID and the close proximity of COVID, for sure. And I think the fact that women end up being poor after divorce versus men, to me, that's the natural result of, if it's hard to get the male partner in a heterosexual relationship to pull his weight when he's in the house, it's going to be even harder to get him to pull it when he isn't. And, I think that women, I think as your book deals with quite beautifully, women do take on these tasks. And if there's a sense that there's something missing, they step in to fill it. And their competence and willingness in a way creates a vacuum that other people then feel, well, I don't have to do this because she's doing it. And the difficulty is that to, have a domestic strike where you're like, okay, I'm not going to do any care work. which, might ultimately be effective, the person who's really going to pay the price of that is the children. And I think most women are not prepared to make their children pay the price to, beat a better arrangement out of their husbands or their partners. So who are not contributing to the same degree. And so I think it's very, the social work that we need to do to change that gendered arrangement of who provides this kind of emotional care and, as you describe it, effective care in the home domestically. That's not really it's not really a legal, there's not many legal tools to create that change, but definitely it's having an impact on things that, do then come into the legal arena.
I like the way you've put that, because I'm often asked, well, do you think the government can do anything, and what laws do you think would be better? And I'm always like, I don't know. But I think you're right that like these cultural shifts will chip away at the law and vice versa. So yeah, that work that needs to be done in the home is just really personal and challenging, I think, for women. I've been thinking about elder care a little bit as we've been chatting, because it has taken center stage in the pandemic. And I've seen a lot of, like I saw, like as Martha, you were saying over the weekend, that health journalist in BC saying like, pull your elder relatives from care. And like, and I've seen a lot of people say like, wow, look at the way we treat our elderly relatives. We put them in these centers and look at the atrocious conditions, and like, how can we as a society condone this? And it would be a much better thing to not do this. And I just think, yeah, on the backs of women, that is what we're saying. And we can talk about childcare and COVID and homeschooling and how that's been hard for women, and elder care and women doing it has been out of the conversation, which is confusing, I think. Like with like we have as much research on both, like in terms of the sandwich generation and yeah, those expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I do love the thing that now moms are taking meetings from work with their child on their knee. I mean, I think it makes the work of childcare very obvious and patent in a way that, as you point out in your book, women have worked hard to make it invisible, that work. And it isn't helpful to have that work be invisible. And the more visible that work can be, the more as a society we can respond to the need of that work. And I totally agree. Sending every elderly person home to be cared for by an already overburdened mom or woman is probably not even going to result in better care for those elderly people, because I think an exhausted, unskilled carer of an elderly person is going to be a person who's bad-tempered and, potentially. I mean, I think privatization also comes sometimes with exposure to risk. And so, yes, it's very risky to be in a long-term care home, but it's not that much less risky to be, saddling an overburdened person who's already working and perhaps looking after younger children. So, it's obvious that we're doing a poor job of looking after our elders, but sending them home mustn't be the solution. And I think as women, we have to push back hard against that. And, we have to say that institutional care, or maybe we need to, move that care more into family-like modules or something more like a co-op housing arrangement and less like a hospital. But we need to work hard to define that care so that it's caring of elders without suggesting that we just privatize it. I mean, our government is happy to have families, with disabled children working themselves to the very edge of their capacity and beyond, and saying that's your responsibility, we don't pay for that. And they will do the same with elder care if they get a chance. And we mustn't shoulder that burden domestically. I think it's, I think that it I think it would be really a tragedy if that's the meaning that gets made out of the COVID mess in long-term care homes.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one of the things, and I think we'll just try to wrap on this idea of, visibilization, if there's even a word, of care work, right? Like, I remember being one of the few women who dragged my daughter to meetings because I did not have childcare, and not intimate meetings, but meetings where I was giving a talk and she could sit at the back and play and she'd color. She came and did a couple of I did a couple of big copyright talks, and she'd sit there with her coloring book. And now, this isn't going to work for every child, obviously. And it I think really made it plain that this is, where I go, she goes, unless you're going to cover the costs. And that was the other thing, is that none of these organizations included in their budgets the idea that they should include a care budget. So, an understanding that people are taking time out of their day in order to do this workshop or whatever it is, and that actually that should be built into the budget. So we've built into our budget, for example, we used to when we had face-to-face workshops, particularly out of the Lower Mainland, I made sure that if you were coming and you were going to give a session for a group there in the Kootenays, which was where we did a lot of work at one point, we would have your care covered as part of the deal. They were mostly volunteers. They were not all women, but primarily women, and they were taking time out in the evening to do this. And a couple of them had small kids, and I said, just bill us the $30. And that should be normalized. And we really do need to find ways when we're holding events, when we go back to face-to-face conferences, if we want women to participate in them, and parents in general to participate more fully in them, that we include childcare. And sure, why haven't I been to West Coast Leaf Breakfast? Well, there's a reason right there. And at once Anna Grace, I no longer needed to have her in childcare or get a babysitter for her. It was work time, and the work I do from 8 in the morning till 10 is critical, 7 to 10 really. And I miss all those opportunities because of that. And it always surprised me that, it was much harder to bring her to places or to participate because of the time of things, which I did point out to the Stephen Lewis Foundation when they were here once. And I said to Alana that, maybe you should provide childcare, but it always came down to liability and not having insurance. Anyhow, that's a whole other conversation.
Well, you'll be happy to hear then that West Coast Sleep is doing an online event in the evening instead of the breakfast this year. So you'll be able to participate at a time of day that is not your primary work time.
Right. That when I can just sit back, relax, and turn into a vegetable and binge watch all manner of bad television shows.
Baking shows.
Yes, although I did enjoy, I have to say, the Five Glorias. Since we started out today as it's International Women's Day, Amanda shared with us a little interview with Gloria Steinem. There's a film that Julia Taymor made, which is called The Five Glorias, and it's streaming on, I don't remember where, but it was very amusing to watch. And for those of you who do have younger daughters, maybe middle school and older, who might take an interest in Miss Steinem and feminism in general, it's not a bad little movie to watch, and prompts lots of questions because it's her whole life. So you really get a piece of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, and today. I want to thank Clea and Amanda for making time today to participate with us. We are having a random draw for Amanda's book. So after, when we get back to the office, we will put your names all in a bin. Actually, we'll just choose a number of who's on the list, and we'll make arrangements to get the book to you. And thanks, Paige and Angela, for your good work today, and to everybody for showing up. Enjoy the day, go out for a walk. Viva la revolución.
Thanks very much for having me, everybody. It was great to chat with you. Thanks, Clea.
Thanks, Amanda. That was fun.
Bye.
Happy Women's Day.
Happy International Women's Day. Bye.